I have the privilege of introducing our guest for this afternoon. Mike Gonzalez is a senior fellow at the Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Before working at Heritage, Mr. Gonzalez spent close to 20 years as a journalist, 15 of those reporting from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Mr. Gonzalez left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was speechwriter for SEC Chairman Christopher Cox before moving on to the Senate Department's European Bureau, where he wrote speeches and op-eds. He has been a research fellow at Heritage for about 4 years. We are fortunate to have Mr. Gonzalez as our guest today. After he has finished speaking, we'll have some time for Q&A, and there will be microphones passed around. Without further ado, speaking on American Balkanization, a failed 40-year experiment, we need to return to E Pluribus Unum, Mr. Mike Gonzalez.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you. No, I got my own, I think. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me fine? Thank you, Madeline, and I want to thank Yale. I love coming to Yale, by the way. It's such a beautiful campus, and I want to thank the William F. Buckley Jr. program. But William F. Buckley actually deeply believed in taking his message out to, in intellectual diversity. Firing Line was a prime example of that. It was on PBS for many years. I was the rare kid who never watched Big Bird. I just watched Firing Line. I speak at campuses across the country, but I especially like coming to your campus. I mean, it's a cliche, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. You really are going to be the leaders. And I can tell you, as somebody who's 57, who spent many years at the Wall Street Journal, many years in Washington, and many years at the Heritage Foundation, Yale students do so well. And so you really are going to be future leaders. And the reason I've left the comfort of my home and children and wife and all that is because I think that I'd love to interact with you. I wore my Columbia tie just to try to troll you a little bit, but I'm here to talk about an issue that I write about often. It's and I'm going to read a little bit because I like being precise by the way I state things. And I'm going to work with two different computers. I'm going to speak for about between 25 minutes and 35 minutes, and then I'll take questions. An issue that really has gripped the West for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been traveling. I traveled to Europe a lot. Just recently, I was in Budapest. I spent some time there. Then I went to Warsaw, and this is an issue. And I went last year. I traveled all over Europe. I went to Western Europe. I went to Malta, speaking about these issues. And it's really not just an issue here in the U.S., but an issue all over the West. And that is how national identity is being challenged, especially by identity politics, and how it happened, why it happened, what we can do about it. Now, I believe our national unity is best described in the motto, E Pluribus Unum, has never been more challenged, and part of it is technological. There are technological forces at work that our political parties are not measuring up. There's the communications, rapid communications, rapid travel. I communicate with people all over the world instantaneously, with my mother-in-law in Scotland, with people in Asia. I lived in Asia for many years. And that erodes national borders a little bit, and travel erodes national borders. But while all of that is true, I believe government policy has played a great part, on purpose or not, and perhaps with the best of intentions. I'm not here impugning anybody's motive. In the decline of national unity in this country, and the collateral rise in identity politics. And identity politics is something that now the left is finally beginning to understand that it is a problem. Mark Lilla at Columbia is writing a lot about it. Jonathan Haidt at NYU. In Britain, you have Trevor Phillips, who's saying, this is not what we want. We need social solidarity. There was a great piece in The Guardian. It's really out there, which is the reason I've been traveling a lot. So I'm going to concentrate on government policy, especially, but not only, on the decennial constitutionally mandated U.S. Census. Now, let me get definitional so we all know what we mean. What do I mean by identity politics? Just so we're all on the same page, what I mean is the growing division of the country into adversarial groups based on ethnicity, race, and sexual orientation increasingly. During this talk, when I condemn multiculturalism, I do not mean the fact that America is multi-ethnic. Being multi-ethnic has has been American since the beginning, not just the fact that there were people of other races here when Europeans showed up, but immigrants in different religions showed up right away. The German pietists who came in the 1600s. So America has always been multi-ethnic, but the idea of being multicultural is new. That this idea that we don't have a national culture, but we're just a collection of different national groups, that we're not a nation state, but a state of nations. And that is what I mean. And when I disparage diversity, I do not mean that I don't like being in the same room with people who are different from me. I was born in Cuba. My grandparents were Spaniards. I married a woman born in Scotland and raised in Scotland, 2 Northern Irish parents. 2 of my children were born in Belgium because I was posted there for the Wall Street Journal. I speak several languages. I have lived at least in 8 countries. I was counting them last night, at least a year. And if you say, well, several weeks, there really are too many to count. Because I was a foreign correspondent overseas for 15 years. I was born in Cuba. I left at the age of 12. So I think I've been in this country only for 5 years, if you count it all together. But what I mean by diversity is the ideology that preaches that the contradiction that being a nation made up of adversarial groups is our strength. There's a lot of good data out there that says that this is not so, that this is not our strength. Now, immigration gets a lot of attention as a driver of our divisions. And it's true, the foreign-born population is at a near peak now. The real peak, I think, was 1913, when it was close to 14%. We're getting close to that. I'm a member of that foreign-born population. But therein lies the difference. You know, that peak came during what is called the Ellis Islanders. So immigration starts, like in real rapid immigration starts in 1850, the late 40s, with the potato famine. Industrialization comes into some German states. A lot of Germans who come here, especially German Catholics. And then really then with Ellis Island in the 1890s to 1924, it's people who are really, really different. People from the Middle East, people from Sicily, people from Jewish people from the shtetl, from Eastern Europe. And the way all our institutions, but especially all levels of government, and especially the most important institution, which was the New York City government, because the Ellis Islanders stayed in New York City, they reacted to it very differently from the way we're reacting to it now. So immigration is part of the mix, but what I really concentrate is what government has done, what the U.S. government has done since the 60s, definitely since the 70s. A lot of it with really good intentions. What I believe we have done is our leading institutions are doing the opposite from what we did during Ellis Island. We're creating new silos. We have created silos, and we're pushing people into them and say, you belong in this silo and in this silo only. Unless intersectionality is so difficult to understand, but you can belong to 2 silos and with intersectionality, or 3 or 4. So before I start, I want to tell you something important happened last Friday. But signals the beginning of perhaps a real resistance to this, and a new resistance, not the resistance with a capital R to Donald Trump, but a resistance to what I've been talking about. And here's what happened in a nutshell. You may not be aware of it. Just before leaving office, President Obama on September 2016 proposed creating yet another pan-ethnic group. This one was for the Middle East, North Africa. Americans and American residents with antecedents, with ancestors all the way from Morocco to the Iran-Afghan border. These people, you may not know, these people are now and have been for over 100 years, they counted as white in the US Census. Barack Obama said, we're going to create a new pan-ethnic category and call them MENA, Middle East, North Africa. These are people who are very, very different. Berbers speak a completely different family of languages from Arabs. Kurds, again, speak a different family of, again, not only a different language, but a different family of languages from Arabs and Berbers. Persians, again, the same thing. They're in the same family of languages as the Kurds. And so the very different people. This is what I mean by pan-ethnic groups. And there was a second proposal the administration made, and it proposed putting an older pan-ethnic group, the so-called Hispanic group, on the same footing as other races. Right now, what you get in the census is you get 2 questions. You get, are you Hispanic, are you not Hispanic, question 6, and then question 7, but that was in the last census, what race are you? So let's go to the next slide here so you see, sorry, I have to work 2 systems here. This is what they were proposing. Can you all see? This was a formula. To me, when I saw it in September 2016, was a formula for further balkanizing the nation. And I started writing about it right away for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And to me, this is not something that America should be. So I started fighting against it. I thought, like everyone else, Barack Obama thought that Hillary Clinton was going to come in and was going to rubber stamp these proposals. Then history happened. That didn't happen. Another president was elected. The good news is that last Friday, the Trump administration didn't let it happen. They rejected this proposed change. Or rather, this is the way this happened. Let me just explain it to you, because Washington is a really weird place. The Office of Management and Budget, specifically the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, what we in Washington lovingly called OIRA, simply never responded. They never said, we'll accept this and not accept this. And the Census Bureau had to move ahead. So the Census Bureau, faced with this non-response, said last Friday, we're not going to do this. We're going to go back to the 2010 question. So this question is not going to be on your 2020 census. I played a part in that victory. I've been writing about it, talking about it, going all over the country, and I guess I found a receptive audience in the Trump administration. So I was gratified to see this outcome. Now, the 2010 question that we're going to get in 2020 is not great shakes either. It doesn't make sense to me either. Let me see here. So, as you see here, you get the first question. The country is divided between 2 ethnicities, Hispanic and non-Hispanic, and then they ask for races. And now you see here for the Asian race, they actually don't say a nation group. They ask you for individual countries of origin. That's kind of odd, because being Chinese and Japanese is not a race. And the question is, what is your race? And they offer what happens after the census. And I'm getting somewhere now. What happens after the census is really what happens the year afterward, the tabulations. When the census takes in this data and tabulates it, it doesn't tell the different states. It doesn't tell the different agencies. There are so many Chinese Americans, so many Japanese Americans, so many Indian Americans. It just tabulates it as Asian American. It just tabulates it as Asian. That's what goes into the redistricting that gets done the year after the census. So I always tell people when I speak, what happens in 2020 is really important. What happens in 2021 is even more important. And it goes to the agencies that monitor progress, how policy impacts different people. And this is, I've gotten you here for a certain reason. This is how identity politics, multiculturalism, diversity, and all the things that make your life so difficult here at Yale, all the things that, I know, believe me, I'm very happy I went to college in the 80s. They all started with this and with the EEO form. The decision by the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in 1966 to send out EEO-1 forms to thousands of firms across the country. Every firm, every company that had over 100 employees, and every company that does contracts with the government. I'm going to show you that form in a second. So it identified for the first time a new category of Americans. And this is something that I want to share with you, because you may think that this has been going on forever. Just like a lot of people think the Department of Education was created by Hamilton, it was created by Jimmy Carter. So this is new. All of this is new. The OMB created these different groups in 1977, which tells through the census divides the entire country into 5 different groups. Academics and Marxists later came on and have made use of this, and we're living with these consequences. But I really truly believe they didn't start. I believe they started bureaucratically as a result of the Civil Rights Revolution. And I can go into the Civil Rights Act itself, because the Civil Rights Act, which is a beautiful thing, is a great act. It was necessary. The country needed it, as the same as the Voting Rights Act. But it called for the opposite of this. Academics saw this as very useful in to carry on the social engineering. And I want to read to you from I have a very good book. One of the best historians of the time is John Screntney at, let me see if I can just get it quickly, because he puts it really well. He's at UC San Diego, and he wrote, "It was through affirmative action that policymakers carved out and gave official sanction to a new category of Americans, the minorities. Without much thought given to what they were doing, they created and legitimized for civil society a new discourse of race, group difference, and rights. The new discourse mirrored racist talk and ideas by reinforcing the racial differences of certain ethnic groups." This is how all the stuff that you live with began. So since the late, let me go back to, excuse me. Since the late 70s, since OMB did this and the EO did what it did, we have divided the country into what political scientist David Hollinger has termed the ethno-racial Pentagon. This is the term that we use, the ethno-racial Pentagon, and what I sometimes call the ethno-linguistic Pentagon. It was basically the division of the country into 5 groups. Ward Connerly, with whom I sometimes collaborate, he's great. He calls it the 5 food groups: white, black, Hispanic, Asians, and Indians or Native Americans. It really isn't a pentagon anymore. It's a hexagon now, because in the 90s, in 1997, Pacific Islander and Hawaiian was cleft off the Asian group. But Pentagon has a better ring to it, so we still call it a pentagon, even though it's a hexagon. And with MENA, it would have been 7 groups. Now, there are many problems dividing society in this manner. One of the biggest problems, and the one that I think gets most often ignored, is that it presumes that members within a given group behave the same way, have the same interests. It is actually very anti-diversity, in that it presupposes homogeneity within groups, conformity, and it has enforcement devices that are quite harsh. If you don't submit to expectations of obedience to group interests, you are said to have false consciousness, quote unquote. And if you don't really want to stay within your assigned group, and you may want to wear a sombrero or dreadlocks, then there is the enforcement device called, quote unquote, cultural appropriation, which can drive people out of business. Perchance, if you believe that there are things more important than the group you have been assigned to, for example, being a Catholic, or dare I say, being an American, than belonging to one of these groups, then you're out of luck. This goes against one of the most important traits in American history, one that de Tocqueville recognized in the 1830s when he came to the United States. That is volunteerism. The 5 communities we created in the 60s and 70s are involuntary communities. They're not voluntary. You're pushed there. Being a Catholic, a Democrat, being a stamp collector, these are communities of choice. The ethno-racial Pentagon is premised on the belief that members of groups, and these are groups created by the bureaucrats no less, share inherent traits. To me, this is really ugly stuff. It's also often useless. You want to know what group in America has the highest rate of business formation? It's Korean Americans. You want to know what group in America has the lowest rate of business formation? Laotian Americans. So to give data on Asian Americans is meaningless. It's like saying that Tom Brady and I each averaged 16 touchdown passes last season. It's true, but it's also a meaningless statistic. Tells you nothing. Additionally, the Pentagon can be incredibly cumbersome and expensive for business. This is the famous EO form. This is the form as it is right now. That goes to all companies. And this is submitted every year by NGOs and companies that have over 100 employees to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and to the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program. And it enumerates the employees of the company according to the Pentagonic rules. And unlike with the census in 1970 said, we're going to let you decide. You're going to define yourself and tell us how you define yourself. This is not self-identification. When you go to work at a company, HR is going to be in charge of determining where you belong. And they have to write it down and send it to the government. They have to assign a group to you in no matter how you define yourself, what you think is important in your life, there's somebody in HR thinking about you and where in the Pentagon you fit. Again, I think this is ugly stuff. The Chamber of Commerce estimates, I talked to them yesterday just to make sure, that the EO1 compliance, complying with this form, costs the U.S. economy $500 million every year. I think that that is a very low estimate because they derived that estimate by saying that it takes about 6 hours to fill out this form. It doesn't take 6 hours to fill out this form. But let's say it took 6 hours for somebody at HR, and I've talked to a lot of people in HR who said, no, this is a major headache. And every time I have talked to them, I said, well, how would you send me as a Cuban American? You're Hispanic. So this is very costly. And it would have been even more costly. That was another Trump victory. Last August, OMB stopped the implementation of another bad proposal by former President Obama. This one would have made this form, would have given 3,660 boxes to this form. The chamber estimated the additional cost in the hundreds of millions. So it would have started inching up to $1 billion every year to U.S. companies. And then there's also the fact, so it's costly and cumbersome, there's also the fact that these pan-ethnic groups are very incongruous. The Pentagon pretends that the Hispanic cone, and they wanted to make it paramount to a race until they were stopped. The Pentagon assumes that Hispanics are a single category of Americans who hail from all these countries. These are countries with very different cultures, very different languages, very different ethnicities. So, David Ortiz is Hispanic, as is Cameron Diaz, as is Bruce Chen from Panama, as is George Lopez. Let me catch up here. These are all the people that the Census Bureau asked OMB to categorize as one group tantamount to a race. Let's consider the group MENA. Let's look at that map. It would include Americans who hail from all these places. These are people who do really well, by the way, in the United States. Another little known fact, especially Iranian Americans and Arab Americans have really, really good cultural indicators. They're better than the rest of the population. Arab Americans, for example, are estimated to be, they're estimated to be majority Christian, by the way, so this is not a proxy for any kind of Muslim population. And they have a higher median income than the average American. Iranian Americans, many of whom live in my town, the bulk of whom are professionals who immigrated here during the time of the Shah in 1979, they have a per capita income estimated to be 50% higher than the average American. MENA includes people who does not include people who originate in Pakistan or Afghanistan. So, as I said, it's not a proxy for the Muslim vote or Muslim population. Now, lest you think these people are exotic, Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana, and now the president of Purdue, who, by the way, incidentally, was George W. Bush's head of OMB. Lebanese. This guy, minority. Doug Flutie, you remember him? His grandfather was Lebanese. Now you may say, well, he's only quite a Lebanese. He's not really MENA. Remember the EO1 form that we discussed? Whatever company Doug Flutie's in now, he's not playing football anymore. HR would have been, if they had been in MENA, oh yeah, this guy, yeah, we have an Arab American, Doug Flutie. This guy, actually, I like Ralph Nader. I know many conservatives don't. Arab American, but you don't think of him as he's like a regular guy, right? And my favorite, Darrell Issa, a representative from California, thought to be the wealthiest member of Congress. And this brings us to an important point. Darrell Issa, Doug Flutie, Papi Ortiz, Mitch Daniels, Cameron Diaz are all very successful Americans. They have made millions, they have fame and prestige. And yet the basis for creating these groups in the first place, in the 60s and 70s, with good intentions, was that they were thought to be quote-unquote victims. The EOC makes it abundantly clear in all its literature that though technically, and I'm reading now from the language that appears all the time, so I have to read, quote, every U.S. citizen is a member of some protected class and is entitled to the benefits of EO law. However, the EO laws were passed to correct the history of unfavorable treatment of women and minority group members. And then the EOC defines minorities as the Pentagon -1 group. So not all classes are protected. Simply put, we have to get the government out of the unsavory business of creating pan-ethnic categories that it has no business creating. And the government itself, again, these things are always there. There's a line that says, this has nothing to do with anthropology, this has nothing to do with biology, this has nothing to do with science. These are groups that we made. In every one of these. And go to the Federal Register, every time there's something on this, it has to include that line. These pan-ethnic groups have an incongruity that is increasingly obvious. And the federal government has to get out of the business of telling Americans to sort themselves out according to these groups, to feel victimized, alienated minorities who need government protection from a supposedly cruel and irredeemably racist society. This is not a message that any government ought to be sending its own people. So no wonder we have a problem with identity politics. And it starts here. It starts with all these things. At the center of this idea is an ideology that believes that there are groups in America that are subordinate and oppressed, and there's a group that is privileged and acts as an oppressor. This is a Marxist reading of society, and we need to call it out. We need to identify for what it is and debate with it. It's Marxist talk. Unfortunately, the census has come to be used as an instrument in doing this. It's gone from being what the founders intended, which was merely a survey of people to determine how big congressional districts were going to be, and the taxes, and we have turned into an interest group society through the census and through our other institutions. Influencing this is a panel of these leftist organizations that almost have a vested interest in making us feel the way we do, making us feel like we're victims, that we need government help. Now, let me tell you, because I have to say, there is racism in America. There's discrimination. I shouldn't need to say this, but I have to, because of the things that I've been saying. Of course they are, and they are racists. They are racists in this country. And people's lives are affected by this, and we need to make this stuff illegal, obviously. There's no room in our society for any kind of racism. But again, I lived in Korea 2 years, in Hong Kong 8 years, in France, in Belgium 6 years. We're by no means the most racist society on earth. We're just not. And we're not the only society, not the only country that ever practiced slavery. There's slavery being practiced right now in the world. the country where I was born, Cuba, had slavery. It had many more slaves than America ever did as a proportion of the population. So yes, we have to deal with our issues. We have to deal, somebody was asking me earlier, should we talk about race? Of course. We shouldn't hide it under the rug. We should talk about race. It is an issue to discuss and to see how it affects individual lives. And we have to, how government policy affects different groups is a completely legitimate field of study. But to believe that all outcomes, bad outcomes especially, are a result of racism is to ignore many real issues like, of behavior, of habit, of culture. We should at least talk about that as well. And in fact, and this was proposed by Hollinger, who's a liberal, maybe we should ask that in the census. What is the family formation in your family? Are you a single dad? Are you a single mom? Are you divorced? We should ask these things and have that also inform policy. See how people who come from families, from large families, or small families, or no family, see what the outcomes are in life, and see if that may have anything to do with success or failure. In the meantime, I'm making it my business to get rid of these pan-ethnic groups. At Heritage, we're working on several papers to figure out how to do this, because the whole country wants to get rid of identity politics. Believe me, it's choking us. And it is not something, it was an experiment that began, and now it's descended into something that we almost can't control. And as I said, thank God, conservatives are not going to be able to do this by themselves. We need to reach across the aisle. We need to talk to Mark Lilla. We need to talk to Jonathan Haidt. We need to talk to Trevor Phillips. We need to talk to many good liberals who have a Marxist social understanding and say, no, it's social classes, it's economic classes. This is what causes, and I disagree with them, but I think they understand that what we have done has not made us better, but has made us worse. I really thank you for your attention. I hope it hasn't been that hard, the fact that I was dealing with all this, and of course I'll take your questions and complaints and anything you want. Thank you. So who wants to moderate this?
Yeah, if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'll pass you the mic. Sure. Thank you for your time, Mr. Gonzalez. So my first question, well, actually, sorry, I just have one. So regarding, so Yale has cultural centers, right? And we also have like La Casa for Hispanics, I think it's the Afro-American House for African Americans. Right. There's even a women's center, right? And they traditionally have like relatively, benevolent goals, like, promote, just to foster general like camaraderie within these organizations, but increasingly they're straying towards identity politics, becoming very politically motivated, right, and like making statements. Right. Okay. Do you think these organizations should just be like sanctioned by the university, or do you think they should be straight up kicked off campus?
I don't. I like volunteerism. It's one of the best things about America. When we moved here, my wife is Scottish, and we moved here when I joined the Bush administration. She said within a few months, the neighborhood runs itself. The pool committee runs the pool, and the church runs the neighborhood. And there's no need for government. This is something that is sui generis in the United States. I think if people want to have a cultural club, they can. I have a club of old Cuban men. We eat twice a year. I'm the youngest. There's nothing wrong with that. We've always had that. We've always had a nod to where we came from, our grandparents and parents, and in reality, what I don't like is this idea that I am X, and I only care how policy affects other X's, and what everything is, and I start every sentence, an opinion on any issue, saying, well, as an X, I feel that. I don't start any sentence saying as a Cuban American. Who cares? I have ideas. I have been able to, obviously my experiences have impacted how I feel, but I don't really, but up to a point. I'm able to study Socrates and try to think of him in the Agora, and he was the Greek who lived more than 2,000 years ago. So I don't have anything against people voluntarily sorting themselves out and seeking mutual interest. That's what I want. What I don't want is government doing this, telling us, not giving us a choice. HR, not giving us a choice. Am I answering your question, or?
No, yeah, you are. I guess I should have been a little bit more. I don't want to be too leading with the question, right? But what's interesting about these organizations is that they tend to push a political agenda, right? Like these organizations aren't just like benevolent, like let's all get together as Hispanics, right? They're you know, inherently very liberal organizations,
Right.
And they tend to reject people who don't believe with their ideology, even other Hispanics. It's just something
Well,
that
this is what
experience.
I fight all the time. For example, Dolores Huerta, who was Cesar Chavez's aide-de-camp, she said, no, Ted Cruz is not Hispanic. Well, first of all, I don't think Hispanics exist. It's creation of the federal government. But if you're going to have it, Ted Cruz is Hispanic. He may be a conservative Republican from Texas, but according to EO1 and the census, he's Hispanic. It's not up to Dolores Huerta to decide that. So I don't think, you know, Ted Cruz has spent any time thinking of himself as Hispanic, to be honest, because he's like, you know, he's from Texas. He's a Texan, you know. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for coming today, sir. My question is, what does the state or the government stand to gain by categorizing us into these groups, you know, Hispanic or MENA or Asian? Why would the government even care?
Well, the way it started in the 60s and 70s was the Civil Rights Act, which was a beautiful thing. They, you know, Title VII, I think Section J, said that nothing here implies racial preferences. Nothing here calls for sexual preferences. This act will not have racial preferences. Within 2 or 3 years, we had affirmative action, and we had the famous Back case against Davis, against University of California, that pretty much accepted affirmative action. And then all these other groups were created almost as an afterthought. And very quickly, it was not a response to protest. It was a response. If you read the books of the history of how this happened, it was analogizing to the black experience. How could you say that? How could you analogize to the experience of African Americans who had been brought as slaves, who had been slaves for centuries, and then after the Civil War and after Reconstruction were denied the civil rights in many states? How is my experience any analogy to that? I'm very lucky to be in this country and to have gotten out of communism. And yet, the people who were putting this together decided that, and there's something else, because the Ford Foundation played a very important role in this. And this, again, I'm giving them a lot of credit. I don't want to impugn anybody's motive. They thought that the civil rights revolution would not be able to continue. This is something some people have said, would not be able to continue if it only had one constituent group. But if you expanded the constituency, then it would be something that would be successful. I don't think that's the case. But that's that one part. So I'm giving them all the benefit of the doubt in saying they created these groups. And it's true that, for example, Mexican Americans in the Southwest, although they never really had Jim Crow laws the way, and they were officially categorized as white from 1848 on until 1980, except for 1931, the census asked, "Are you Mexican?" and the Mexican Americans rebelled in the Southwest. As bad as it was in some communities, it was never an analogy to the African American experience in the South. So that I think, am I answering your question? This was an attempt to, so people say, well, identity politics is a result of the 1965 natural immigration law. I said, no, I don't think so. I think it was a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, turning it on its head. Is everybody understand? I hope I'm making myself. I know the weeds, so I assume knowledge. Maybe I don't know.
Thank you.
Who else?
Any more?
Yeah, over here.
Thank you for the talk, and I've read a lot. I'm a Heritage member, so I've read a lot of your stuff.
Thank you.
On the
Thank you, by the way.
the Daily Signal for the past 3-4 years.
So you know how hard I've been working this.
Yes. And Mark Levin for those of who, yeah, if you listen to him or can handle listening to him, has talked a lot about this before. Your professional opinion, what's the chances this any of this stuff? How much of this will get undone in the next 3 years? Realistically,
it can get undone. But then again, you talk to my
yeah,
wife.
it could change.
My wife is a Scottish pessimist, and you know I'm a Cuban optimist. not to be identity politics. You know, I think that because identity politics is now so rancid and so many people are against it. Mark Lilla has come out and he's received a lot of criticism, and all these people, all these liberals are now saying, you know who is actually Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has an old Marxist interpretation of society. And that's why Hillary moved to talk about intersectionality and identity politics, and she started talking about groups, because Bernie's actually really colorblind. You know, a poor person and a worker is a worker, and he still thinks in terms of 19th century Marxism, and he doesn't see. So I actually think that something can get done. As we know, our president, the 45th, he's a disruptor. He likes to disrupt. And if anything can get done, now he did the thing with OMB last year, and they just did this with the census. These groups are really angry. They're really angry. They're all saying, we're going to take this to Congress. We're going to fight this in Congress. You can't do this. You can't. So I think that the way I think, sorry, touch the microphone. The way I think that this can get dismantled is the way it started. By looking at EEO1, looking at the census, and say to reasonable people who believe in a leftist view of society, what do we want? What do we both want? We want social solidarity. We want all to be part of a country that helps each other. How do we get there? We're being atomized. You don't want this, we don't want this. What do we have in common? What do we include in the census? What do we include in EEO1? Why don't we, if we're going to monitor success and failure, let's monitor success and failure across many different dimensions. Am I being too optimistic for you? Yes.
I'm cynical by nature. I don't share. I'm hopeful. I don't share your I guess I don't fully share your optimism. And then the last I read, I think it was in Heritage. They still don't. It's still an acting census director, right? So I mean, I guess the follow-up question is how much power does the census director actually have as far as the formation of the 2020 census?
So as regards to this, to the MENA thing, the president and the Secretary of Commerce and the head of OMB, director of OMB, have a lot of power. We're looking into this. How do you rescind the revisions, the 1997 revisions to the 1977 rule, which I have here, by the way. I could pass it to you. I brought it as props. It all goes back to the 1977 OMB rule, which was called Statistical Directive Number 15, that first identified Hispanics, because up to then there had been no Hispanic group. I think I brought it. So how do you rescind that? Do you need a commenting period? These are all really technical questions. Can the president rescind this rule without comments? You know, and if we do need comments, you know, what do we do? And so I think if you start this way, you start changing, you begin a different discourse than the discourse we have had. I really, really believe that. You had a question? No, over here.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it. I'm sympathetic to your critique of the bureaucratic headaches created by the employment forms out of the human resources offices. And maybe I missed this, but I'm wondering what the connection is between these sorts of regulations and
you mean talking about this?
That and also, you know, racial questions on census on the census. The link between those things and broader. I think you mentioned multicultural animosity in our society and how that's manifested itself.
Yeah, and that's the idea that I want. That's the seed that I want to plant in your mind. That is the Frankenstein monster of this. That this is the Dr. Frankenstein, and that is the monster. You know, that this begat what you're talking about, and it was begat bureaucratically, and it was a beginning. Again, I must say, maybe for the fourth or fifth time, perhaps with the best of intentions, people really wanted to monitor success and failure among different groups. But as I said, Laotian Americans, very, very small rate of business formation. Korean Americans, very, very high rate. I mean, like if you look at the whole American color spectrum, Korean Americans are here, Laotian Americans are here. What does Asian American mean to anybody? You know, Indian Americans have very different rates of heart disease from Filipino Americans, and so you know, household income is very different. The same thing with Cuban Americans and Mexican Americans. Cuban Americans are very different if you look at Miami and if you look at New Jersey. So I think that these, you know, it was just hatched out, and it was done very rapidly too. I have it here. The 77 law, the 77 rule came out just 24 months before the 1980 census, and it was jammed into the 1980 census. So I do think that all this bad stuff that we have, all the animosity, obviously some people saw the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, all this academics said, oh yeah, this is great. We can really use this to divide society. We can really use this to, and the idea that Gramsci, when he was in prison, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist leader, he had this epiphany that, you know, there's been a lot of proletariat for a very long time in very few revolutions. There had only been up to then the French Revolution and the Soviet Revolution. And he thought, you know what, maybe the economic thing is not, maybe we should look at ethnic groups rather than economic groups. And so this idea that begins with Gramsci in prison, and then it carries on to the Frankfurt School, Bella Kunz, and comes over to America, and takes over Columbia University, takes over the Ivies, and takes over Hollywood, was something that was happening at the same time. But I don't want to minimize that, but this is it. To me, this is Dr. Frankenstein, and the rest is the monster. Does that answer your question? Anybody else? Over here.
So I was interested in, so you mentioned the Middle East and North Africa group doing particularly well in the United States when they immigrate. Could you elaborate?
Mitch Daniels. I sat next to Miss Daniels, by the way. I thought he was Irish.
Could you elaborate on that? Like, are there sort of cultural characteristics that distinguish Northern Africa from other parts of Africa, or those particular spots in the Middle East?
Well, at first they were going to include Israelis. Then Jewish groups complained because it would have made a Jewish kid born in Brooklyn, white and a member of the majority, and his cousin born in Jerusalem, a minority. And I would say, like, this makes no sense. So Israel was taken out. Your question, repeat it again?
So what distinguishes Northern Africa from other parts of Africa, or any there? What are the shared cultural characteristics between the Middle East and Northern Africa? Like,
well, I mean, there is some shared, as you know, the Arab invasion that begins in the 600 after Muhammad does come all the way out here and then goes into Spain. So there is. To me, it was a kind of a weird attempt to racialize Islam. A lot of people already think that Islam is an ethnicity or a race, and if you say something anti-Islamic, you're a racist. No, you're a religious bigot. But a Bosnian or an Albanian are Muslims and Europeans. You're not a racist, you're a religious bigot. So I think it was this, just like Hispanics have been racialized, I think this, and by the way, there's an antecedent to racializing a religion. So I think that may have been in the back of their minds, but in reality, there have been Lebanese and Syrian Americans here since the 1890s. They started coming in on their Ellis Island. If you go to Toledo, Ohio, if you go to Dearborn, Michigan. I interned, by the way, decades ago. I was Helen Thomas's intern at the White House. and she was Lebanese American. She hated all this, by the way. She's a very liberal woman who always said to me, I know you're conservative, but I'm still going to send you to see Reagan at the Oval Office. So I was either getting her a sandwich or going to the Oval Office to cover Reagan. It was great to be her intern. She was Lebanese American, hated all this. She said, it's not just if you're born here. If you're naturalized, you're American. That's it. That's Helen Thomas. I quote her in one of my articles.
So do you think that their shared religion contributes to their success?
But they don't share it. That's the thing. Is they don't share religion. But I think that people thought that it would be a way as more people arrive from the Middle East, as you get more immigrants, we're not getting a lot of Christians. What we're getting is a lot of Muslims. And that's going to tip over. At some point, most Arab Americans will be Muslim rather than Maronite. But right now, I think the last time I looked at it, when I wrote about this about 2 years ago, there's still a Maronite majority among Arab Americans. So I think the only thing I can think of, don't ask me to give you a logic as to why this would be one ethnic group, one ethnic category in one race. It isn't. It isn't. A Kurd is very different from a Berber. But this is what they wanted. Go ahead.
So you kind of went over a lot of examples of, I don't even know if this is on, of the government sort of forcing this categorization through things like the census and sort of other paperwork. Are there other examples that you see the government actively doing in the past 5 or 10 years that's been a forcing of this racial categorization?
Well, I mean, oh my God, it's just taken on a life of its own. There's something called culturally responsive teaching, which I've written about for the Washington Post. That is in my. We're spending lots of money on culturally responsive teaching, which says that you should teach different subjects differently to members of each different group, even math. Even math. You know, this is ugly stuff. And I actually went back to. I live in accounting, and I looked at see how much they were spending on culturally responsive training, and it was like 3,000 computers. It was 3,000 Promethean books that they could have spent for the kids, and instead they were spending on culturally responsive teaching. So it's a lot of stuff that it's too much to. I mean, I just named that. You know, in 1910, when you came in from Ireland or Sicily, or you came in and there was which I think is fine, and I don't have a problem with it. It was an Americanization process. I actually benefited from that. I immigrated in 1974. I went to an Americanization class. You know what they taught me? They taught me American songs. They taught me if I had a hammer. They taught me My Country 'Tis of Thee. They taught me many things that I wouldn't have gotten because I was already too old. If I hadn't learned them in that class with that teacher there, she was an awful piano player, but she really put her, you know, that was a very important thing to help me integrate and understand the society of which I was going to be a member. That's probably the last Americanization class that New York City schools ever had. You know, they probably changed like 1 or 2 years after that. Who has a question? Nobody else? We're good? Madeline? We good? Okay, no, say, nobody else has a question?
If anyone has any further questions, got the mic here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.